The American Revolution is often seen as a distinctly pastoral affair, be it the North Bridge of Concord or George Washington crossing the Delaware. We have largely rural images in mind. But in fact, much of that revolution began in the dense confines of urban corridors, began as ideas moved across people, as coalitions formed and unformed. So let's start at the beginning. What were they unhappy about? Why did these colonists come up with this crazy idea that they were going to fight a war with their lawful sovereign?
In the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, Bostonians in particular had a lot to be unhappy about. Wartime contracts, such as they were, had dried up, leading to economic contraction. Their bankruptcies were being declared. There was a huge fire in Boston in 1760 that had done a lot of damage. And so there were all sorts of underlying reasons why there would be a lot of unhappiness. But then the British Empire, having fought this war on behalf of North America, said, well, we'd really like to kind of pay for that war, the debts that we've incurred, and for the continuing troop presence to protect Americans in what's now the Midwest and in other fortifications. And so they asked the Americans to begin paying for things, and they tightened up customs restrictions in order to make sure that Americans were paying their taxes to sustain the British Empire. And so that was leading to new kinds of enforcement on the waterfront in places like Boston that was also making a lot of people really unhappy.
What do they do about it, and how does the city affect the way that they react to these things?
Basically, one of the ways that I like to think about Boston is a series of overlapping organizational networks that were sometimes allied with one another and sometimes not, but there was a rich kind of social capital that Bostonians could draw on. If you were elite, you might belong to the toniest clubs, you might have friends in the legislature, you had all sorts of ways of making your voice heard. If you were more middle class, there were also a lot of clubs you could join, clubs that represented certain artisan groups, ethnic societies, trade societies of various kinds, volunteer fire companies, social clubs that met once a week. So they too had an outlet for potentially making their voices heard.
These clubs were so easy to form because everyone lived so close to one another, right?
Yeah. I mean, Boston is basically 2 miles long. I mean, it's really small, and 16,000 people. Everybody more or less knew one another, and particularly if you narrow that population down to adult men, it's an even smaller population. So that was part of the rich colonial history of Boston. And Boston has an advantage, actually, in terms of political mobilization over New York and Philadelphia, in that it's a relatively ethnically and religiously homogeneous town, right? Most of them are English-descended Congregationalists for the most part. That allows for a lot of common ground to be built.
So tell us about Sam Adams. How did Sam Adams get involved in politics? What did he bring to the table in terms of creating these networks?
Samuel Adams was Harvard educated, he was pious, he was a great networker. I think his role is often misunderstood. People think that he was some sort of puppet master that could snap his fingers and the mob would be called to action. But I really think that's an unfortunate exaggeration. The ordinary working class folk in Boston largely often had their own interests, but Samuel Adams knew how to kind of reach out to those groups. He had contacts and friends. He evinced sympathy for people from various walks of life. And so he was a great connector between his legislative position, which is that he represents Boston in the general court, but then also through the ordinary waterfront workers who comprised so much of Boston.
Right. So he would have been the natural connection between an ordinary dock worker and John Hancock himself, right?
Potentially. I mean, not alone, right? What you find if you start studying Boston is that there's actually a deep bullpen of the kinds of people who can make these connections.
That's always important in cities, right? The genius of cities is communal. It's about lots of different people. It's not about one particular great person. Sam Adams, in some sense, has come to symbolize this sort of social networking, but he's hardly the only player.
I think that's exactly right.